Until the second half of the 19th century, Greek and Israeli sources contain much but inaccurate information about the Assyrians and Babylonians. The Sumerians were not mentioned at all at that time. Curious Western scholars traveled to Mesopotamia at various dates in search of the Assyrians and Babylonians. The first knowledge of these ancient sites came in the 12th century when the Lord of Tudela in the Kingdom of Navarra visited the Jews in Mosul and found the ruins of Nineveh and pinpointed their exact location. But this remained unpublished until the 16th century. In 1616, a Roman traveler named Pietro della Yala went there and found the ruins of the ancient city of Ur, described them in detail, and brought back a brick, the first cuneiform document. The hill on which these ruins were located was called by the Arabs Tel el-Mugayir, meaning the hill of pitch. In the 17th and 18th centuries, more and more people traveled to Mesopotamia in search of the places written in the Torah. They began to speculate that the places they visited might be the places mentioned in the Torah. Between 1766 and 1771, Carsten Niebuhr, a Danish mathematician, traveled to Mesopotamia and made a complete sketch of the ruins of Nineveh. And from there, he traveled to the ruins of Persepolis in Iran, where he copied the inscriptions on the doors of the ruins of buildings and brought them back to Europe. A year later, the French botanist A. Michaud, who had traveled to the same places, brought a border stone he had found south of Baghdad to Paris and presented it to the Bibliothèque Nationale. This was the first valuable inscription to reach Europe. In this inscription, a curse is written against those who break the border. What is written in one part of this curse is very interesting. The soldiers of heaven will water us with vinegar as a real remedy for our recovery. The Abbé Beauchamp, who was at that time the herald of the Academy of Sciences in Baghdad, had also observed the ruins around Babylon and had also carried out a small excavation and unearthed the so-called Babylonian lion. He was also the first to introduce the Ishtar Gate, a replica of which is now in the Berlin Museum. He also said that the markings on a clay cylinder found resembled the markings on the doors in Persepolis. Abbé Beauchamp's account of the trip, which was translated into German and English in 1790, was received with great enthusiasm by scholars. In response, the East India Company in London commissioned its agent in Baghdad to conduct archaeological research there. Claudius James Rich, an employee of the company, made a sketch of the ruins of Babylon and even had a site excavated in a simple manner. Rich returned to Mosul 9 years later and made a good sketch of the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh. He found many tablets, bricks, boundary stones, and clay cylinders with inscriptions. Among them are the famous cylinders with the subjects of the Assyrian kings Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib. Rich had his secretary Carrie Bellino copy them and send them to Grotefend, a high school teacher and epigraphist in Germany. Rich died in 1821 at the age of 34. His work, sketches, and notes became the cornerstone of Assyriology and cuneiform research. He was followed by Robert Kerr Porter, who drew plans and sketches of Mesopotamian ruins and Babylonian ruins like an artist. In 1828, Robert Mignon carried out a very deep excavation at the site where Rich had begun in 1811. For the first time, a cylinder with writing on it was found in that excavation. In 1830, two Englishmen, J. Bailey Fraser and William F. Ainsworth, traveled to southern Mesopotamia and saw some ruins of cities there. But they had no idea that these city ruins belonged to the Sumerians. In 1842, Paul-Émile Botta, who was the French consul in Mosul, started for the first time a partially systematic excavation in northern Mesopotamia, today known as Assyrian territory. This excavation yielded thousands of documents written in Akkadian and cuneiform. But at that time, neither their language nor their writing was known. Their decipherment was made possible by the inscriptions found in Persepolis. Persepolis was the capital of the ancient Persian kings in western Iran. The first information about it was obtained from the notes of Jehoshaphat Barbaros, the Venetian ambassador to Persia at the beginning of the 16th century, published in 1543. Antonio de Guesa, the Spanish and Portuguese ambassador to Iran, mentioned the inscriptions in Persepolis in his book, published in 1611, and said that they were unlike any other writing known up to that time. In a book written by the next ambassador, Don Garcia Silva Figueroa, and published in 1620, he suggested that Persepolis could be the palace of the Achaemenid king Darius, based on what had been previously published. It is reported that the shapes on the stones look like a three-cornered pyramid, The shapes are similar, but the postures are different. In the ruins of Persepolis, the columns of a great palace, doorstones, various sculptures and reliefs are scattered around. The sides of the city are surrounded by tombs carved into the rocks as ornaments. In his letter dated October 21, 1621, Pietro della Valle writes that he visited Persepolis and copied 5 of the signs on the stones, which he guessed would be read from left to right as a script. In 1673, a French artist, André Dollier de Landes, made a model of the Persepolis palace for the first time. He copied 3 signs from the inscription and suggested that it was an ornament. Sir Thomas Herbert, the British ambassador to Persia in 1677, made a poor copy of 3 lines of the book and said, "The signs here do not look like letters or hieroglyphs. Since it cannot be said whether they are words or letters, their decipherment is impossible. I think, however, that they may be shorthand or similar abbreviated meaningful words or syllables," he wrote. In 1693, Samuel Flower, an employee of the East India Company, published 26 signs he had copied from inscriptions, but they were useless as they were taken separately from various inscriptions. In 1700, it was concluded that they were a script, and it was called Cuneiform, which means angular. Dane Carsten Niebuhr was the first to decipher the inscriptions. In 1773, he copied an entire trilingual inscription and divided them into 3 classes. First, second, and third, saying that they were of 3 different cuneiform types, written from left to right. He determined that the first class was an alphabetic writing system consisting of 42 letters, but that these 3 different writing systems were not used for 3 different languages, but for 1 language. In 1798, the Dane Friedrich Munster also reported that the second and third classes were word and syllabic scripts, and that 3 different languages were written with all 3. But what were these languages? How could they be understood? The first answer was provided by the work of the Frenchman scientist Duperron, published in 1771. He had traveled to India to collect the writings of the Zoroastrian holy book Avesta, and to learn how to read and interpret its language, ancient Persian. The publication of this work gave researchers an insight into ancient Persian. The first of the inscriptions had to be in ancient Persian. In 1793, Silvestre de Sacy translated the Pahlavi inscriptions from around Persepolis. They were actually hundreds of years later than the Persepolis inscriptions, but the word order there could match the order of the Persepolis inscriptions. This order was as follows: the King of Kings, the Great King, the King of X, the Great King, Son of X, the King of X, Y. Of course, it was the king who dictated these inscriptions and built the building. Therefore, the inscription should have been written according to this formula. Olaf Gerhard Teichsen was the first to take the right step towards deciphering these inscriptions. He understood what the 4 signs were. One of them was repeated over and over again. He determined that this was a mark that separated the words. Thus, the beginning and end of words were revealed. This was published in 1798. In the same year, the Dane Friedrich Munster argued in 2 articles that the Persepolis inscriptions belonged to the Achaemenid kings, but he did not bother with the decipherment of the inscriptions. Instead, Friedrich Grotefend, a Greek teacher at the Göttingen High School, thought that the frequent signs in the first of the 3 classes of inscriptions might be vowels. And according to the published Pahlavi inscriptions, he separated the name of the father of the king who built the monument and the signs containing the words king and son. He then compared the signs according to the names of the Achaemenid kings and thus identified 10 signs and 3 personal names. According to this discovery, in 1802, he published a translation of the inscription, Darius, the great king of kings, son of the great king Histispas, king of kings. But there were many mistakes in the translation. Some scholars approved him, others ridiculed him. There were those who continued his work, but the solution did not advance because the inscriptions were short and the words were few. Henry Greswick Rawlinson, who worked in the spy service of the British Army in India, was able to decipher the inscription. He had copies made of the inscriptions on Mount Alvand near Hamadan and the Behishtan rock inscriptions about 20 kilometers from Kermanshah. The 40 square meter face of these rocks, some 100 meters above the ground, had been specially smoothed and inscribed with reliefs in 3 languages: Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite. Rawlinson erected a scaffold there and climbed up the rock with rope ladders to begin copying the Persian part of the inscription, 414 lines in 5 columns at the top. Rawlinson, who came from time to time and completed the copying of 200 lines until 1837, without being aware of the work done before, especially Grotefend's work, based on classical authors and medieval geographers, read a few hundred place names with Grotefend's method and transcribed and translated these 200 lines. It was only in 1844 that he was able to copy the remaining 263 lines of the Babylonian part, thus sending the entire Persian inscription with its transcription, translation, and commentary from Baghdad to the Royal Asiatic Society in England. Meanwhile, the Irishman Edward Hincks published an article proving his work. Jules Opper also contributed a lot to these studies. Although some additions and changes were made to the text as a result of these efforts, these changes were not in a way that would distort the meaning of the text. Meanwhile, excavations in Mesopotamia were taking place one after the other. Paul-Émile Botta, who had been appointed as the French consul in Mosul in 1842, started excavating in the Koyunluk and Nebi Yunus hills, but found nothing. A villager told him that there were large statues nearby, and on the basis of this, he found the ruins of Khorassabat. There he found statues, reliefs, and wall decorations spread over a large area, all with cuneiform inscriptions. This was the palace of Sargon II, the powerful king of Assyria. 3 years later, Austin Henry Layard, an Englishman, conducted excavations in Nemrut and Nineveh. King palaces and statues were also found in these excavations. Most important of all was the discovery of the library in the palace of King Sargon's grandson, King Assurbanipal. Thousands of tablets and fragments were found in this library, covering various subjects such as dictionaries, various literary works, letters, fortune-telling, and magic. All these written documents were carried to Europe, but they were impossible to read and understand. Although there were 42 signs in Persian, there were tons of similar and dissimilar signs. Hincks first identified a number of vowels, syllables, and ideograms based on the many proper names found in the Persian part of the Behishtan inscription. He also read in Babylonian the Hebrew word for me, anaku. Meanwhile, Émile Botta noticed that the signs were written differently, although they had the same meaning and pronunciation. As a result of the studies carried out by both of them, it was understood that this writing was syllabic and morphological. Either words were composed of these syllables, or a word was written with a single sign. Again, these studies were combined with Rawlinson's discoveries. In 1847, he went back to Behishtan and copied 112 more lines of the Babylonian text. He began to decipher them with the help of the Persian part and read 150 signs correctly. He thus revealed the pronunciation and meaning of 200 words. These showed that the language was Semitic. Based on this solution, he even wrote a draft of the grammar of the language. Based on his work, which was published in 1850-51, Hincks also deciphered more than 100 signs, and thus the reading of 350 signs was understood. Interestingly, many scholars did not believe in their invention. It was inconceivable to them that these ancient people could have invented signs of countless values. In 1855, Jules Opper reported that he had added to the few signs that Rawlinson and Hincks had read correctly. In the Assurbanipal library, syllable lists written by ancient scribes had been found. Jules Opper had made translations from them. His scientific works and textual studies on this subject helped to establish the science of Assyriology. In addition, W.F. Fox Talbot, a mathematician by profession and an amateur Orientalist, was also interested in these topics and worked on the publications of Hincks and Rawlinson and translated some Assyrian texts. He translated from a copy of a cylinder containing an inscription of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser, sealed it, and sent it to the Royal Asiatic Society in March 1857. He suggested that Rawlinson and Hincks be asked to translate the same text. The suggestion was accepted. They were joined by Jules Opper. They all translated the same text and sent it to the institution in sealed envelopes. The envelopes were opened by a 5-person jury. Although there were some differences between them, in general, the translations were very close to each other. Thus, a brand new branch of science, Assyriology, was born. In the following years, scholars in England, France, and especially Germany began to write articles and books on language, history, religion, and culture in this new field. Thousands of excavated texts were copied and published. Sign lists, dictionaries, grammars, and publications containing high-level information on syntax were published. Thus, first Assyrian, then Babylonian, then Akkadian, the term used by the Mesopotamians, developed immensely. Since then, it has been developing continuously, and dictionaries have been made using the accumulated scientific studies. Did anything catch your attention? Assyrian, Babylonian, and Akkadian have been mentioned so far. Sumerian and Sumerians have never been mentioned, because for a long time no one knew about the Sumerians. In 1850, Hanks, in his lecture at the British Association, first stated that the Semitic people, whom we call the Akkadians, did not invent the cuneiform script, because this script did not fit the Semitic language at all, and that if the Semites had invented this script, they should have made it suitable for their own language. Hinks therefore argued that cuneiform was invented by a non-Semitic people who lived in Babylon before the Semites. 2 years later, in 1852, Rawlinson, examining the word lis, reported that they were in two languages, with Assyrian words opposite words from a non-Semitic language, and suggested that this language might be Scythian or Turanian. A year later, Rawlinson gave another lecture in which he said that the bricks and tablets from the south of Babylon were written in a non-Semitic language, Scythian. He called this language Akkadian and explained that they had come and settled there before the Babylonians. Thus, Rawlinson was the first to discover the Sumerian language. Rawlinson said that this language was closer to Mongolian and Manchu in terms of pronouns, but had no similarities in terms of words. Jules Oppert again suggested that this non-Semitic language must be Sumerian. Based on the titles of Sumerian and Akkadian kings found in the inscriptions of ancient kings, she proved that the Semitic people living in Assyria and Babylon were called Akkadians, and the non-Semitic speakers were Sumerians. According to him, the Sumerian language was also related to the Turkic, Finnish, and Hungarian languages. However, 20 years ago, scientists did not even know that Sumerians existed. Nevertheless, for quite a long time, scholars used Akkadian instead of Sumerian. Interestingly, despite all the evidence, Joseph Halevi claimed that there was no such language as Sumerian, that it was artificially invented as a secret language by the Semitic clergy in Babylon, and some famous Assyriologists joined him. Soon after, in southern Mesopotamia, Ernest de Sarzeck conducted an 11-year excavation at the French Tello Mound, formerly Lagash, between 1877 and 1900. Many statues, reliefs, the famous Goudia cylinders, and masses of tablets dated Umanesha were found there. These were published by Ernest de Sarzeck, François Théara d'Angen, and Léon Houzé. The excavations at Tello resumed in 1903 by Henri de Genouillac and continued until 1909, followed by André Perrault's excavations between 1931 and 1933. A total of 20 excavation seasons at Tello. In 1948, André Perrault published a compilation of all these excavations in his book, Tello. Almost 40,000 of the tablets recovered from the site are in the Istanbul archaeological museums, waiting for Turkish experts to work on them. The second major excavation of the Sumerians was undertaken by the Americans. 4 excavations were carried out there between 1889 and 1900 under the direction of J. Peters, J. H. Haynes, and H. V. Hilprecht, respectively. During these excavations, the excavators faced great difficulties. Some fell ill, and one young archaeologist died. Their food and horses were stolen, the workers revolted, and their shelters were burned. They did not give up the excavation and continued to dig in sandstorms and temperatures of up to 50 degrees Celsius. All these sorrows and fatigue were worth it, because more than 30,000 tablets were found here, written in a city for 2,500 years, starting from 2500 BC until the birth of Jesus. Most of these were in Sumerian. Many scholars, notably Hilprecht, began publishing these tablets in 1893. Unfortunately, the planned volumes could not be completed due to many difficulties. Nevertheless, even those that were published were very useful for the study of cuneiform. The decipherment of the Sumerian language was also greatly helped by Rawlinson's publication of the bilingual dictionaries and word lists found in the library of Assurbanipal. However, these tablets were written at least 1,000 years after the Sumerians had left political life. Most of the thousands of tablets excavated at Nippur and Lagash belonged to state and temple administration. These are lists of materials brought to palaces and temples and consumed by these institutions. In these lists, it is written on a daily basis by whom these materials were brought and consumed. These daily lists were then added up and written as weekly, weekly as monthly, and monthly as yearly lists. These are considered to be the oldest statistics in history. In addition to these, there are contracts of sale, rent, marriage, divorce, inheritance division, debt notes, court minutes, and documents written by students called school tablets. Thanks to these documents, it was possible to obtain extensive information about the social and economic structure and education of the Sumerians. The first work on the Sumerian language was done by the Englishman A.H. Sayce, who in 1871 published a translation of a 12-line text of King Shogi with some comments. Paul Haupt copied and published some tablets in the library of Assurbanipal, consisting of 2 languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, and 1 Sumerian language. In 1905 to 1907, R.E. Bruno published for the first time a list of the readings of Sumerian writing signs and a dictionary of Sumerian words extracted from the documents published up to that time. After these, Friedrich Delitzsch gathered together a dictionary showing the roots of Sumerian words and information on Sumerian grammar. The French Thoreau Dengen's work on Sumerian tablets and his findings were so accurate that they remained unchanged until recently. Arno Pobel took these studies further, collecting monolingual and bilingual texts from 3000 to the 100th century, and from them he established the basic rules of Sumerian grammar. Later, scholars such as Thorkild Jacobsen, Adam Falkenstein, Anton Daimel, and C.J. Gadd made additions and corrections. Despite all these efforts, a complete Sumerian dictionary could not be made. The University Museum of Philadelphia has taken on the task, but it is said to take until 2030 to complete. After the excavations at Lagash and Nippur, where Sumerian documents were found, the Germans, under the direction of Robert Koldewey, excavated Shuruppak, the city of the flood hero Ziusudra, now called Farah, and found texts and written tablets dating back to 2500 BC, including economic, administrative, and some literary texts and dictionaries. Their writing was old and very difficult to read. Such texts were also found at Abu Salabi, whose ancient name is unknown. Among these texts, documents on the buying, selling, and renting of fields and houses were found, showing that private property existed in Sumer in those times as well. Dictionary texts also reported the existence of schools at that time. This was extremely important for the history of civilization. Between 1922 and 1934, the British representative Leonard Woolley conducted an excavation in the place called Urim by the Sumerians, which is written in the Torah as Ur, the homeland of the prophet Abraham. The discovery of rich tombs of kings in this excavation caused great excitement in the world. The second excitement was that a thick layer of mud in the last excavation proved that the flood had happened in Mesopotamia. Newspapers reported this with big headlines, but later research showed that this could not be true. Many Sumerian tablets have also been found here. Scholars such as Léon Legrain and C.J. Gadd have published copies of many of these tablets and translations of others. Woolley's excavation at Alubaid, a small mound about 6 kilometers north of Ur, is of great importance in terms of the culture before the Sumerians. There was no writing and the remains of a small temple were found. However, the tools and vessels they used showed a distinction. This culture is now dated to 5900 BC. Excavations have shown that it extended to Mesopotamia, Syria, and even Anatolia. In 1945 to 49, museum director Taha Bakir excavated the Tel Harmel Mountain, 9 kilometers east of Baghdad, and found a temple and some 2,000 tablets. Most of these were related to vocabulary and mathematics. Between 1946 to 49, Fuat Safar and Satan Lloyd excavated in Eridu, Abu Sharan, the city of Enki, the Sumerian god of water and wisdom. According to the text, Sumerian creation began in Eridu. A reed had not yet grown, a tree had not yet been created, a house had not yet been built, a city had not yet been founded. The sea was all around. Then Eridu was made, the text reads. Eridu is located 19 kilometers southwest of Ur. Only the remains of a single ziggurat were seen here. The excavations were very interesting. As they dug, there were temples built one on top of the other. When we went down to the 6th floor from the top, graves were found, estimated to be about 1,000 in number. The most interesting of these was probably the skeletons of a man and a child, along with the skeletons of a dog. According to the bones, these dated to around 6000 BC. It was consistent with the Alubade culture mentioned earlier. This culture is said to have started around 5900 BC and ended around 4000 BC. After the sixth floor, there are up to 12 floors. The last floors are older than the Alubade culture, which is very important for Mesopotamian culture. Although Eridu was the city of the god of wisdom, for some reason not a single tablet was found there. The very brief information given so far about the excavations, carried out for long periods of time with great devotion, and the hard work that went into deciphering the tablets found in these excavations, probably explains how difficult it was to achieve the science of cuneiform writing.